Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 15. 1 week to go, right? So we're almost done. So I know it's a busy time of the semester for everybody. So hang in there, and within a couple of weeks we'll be done. Couple of announcements. Obviously, your paper's still coming up within a couple of weeks. So if you haven't started on that, you need to get cracking on it. If you have any questions about it or you want to send me a copy, I'd be happy to look at it if you get it to me, by the date that I have listed on the paper guidelines. So happy to do that. Also, today is the New York primary. If you guys are still following the presidential election after our first half of the class focusing primarily on the presidency, should be an interesting night tonight if you wanted to tune into CNN. Also, the Florida Senate race is underway, and it's starting to heat up a bit to replace Marco Rubio. So don't just tune in for the presidential election. Stay tuned for the Senate race because that's really important as well. Okay, so this week we're going to talk a little bit about the Anti-Federalists. Last week we talked about federalism, right? The Federalist Papers. So this week I wanted to sort of give a nod to those who were opposing the Federalists, or the people that the Federalist Papers were responding to, right? Who have become known as the Anti-Federalists, which is interesting considering that if you look at sort of the original definition of the word federalism and what Federalists meant during the time that they were actually writing the convention, originally Federalists meant one who supported the government under the Articles of Confederation. So, as a point of fact, the Constitutionalists were actually anti-Federalists, right? And that you can see that. And so Brutus, I had you guys look at the essays, a couple of essays of Brutus, but Brutus was just one of the anti-Federalists, right? There were a lot of other anti-Federalists out there. And if you look at the name of some of the other people, usually they had pen names, right? They didn't sign it their original name. Obviously, the guy who wrote the essays of Brutus was not named Brutus. His actual name was Robert Yates. He was the Supreme Court Justice for New York. But if you look at some of the other names, there's things like the Federal Farmer, right? So they even saw themselves as being Federalists. And if you understand what federalism means, it's a system of government where the power is shared or distributed between the central government, national government, and the state governments, right? So there's a sort of distribution of power there. So if you look at what the Federalists, as they're called, were trying to accomplish, they were trying to essentially consolidate, the bulk of the power in a strong central government, right, and weaken the states. So in that sense, it seems like, as confusing as it is, that the Federalists weren't really all that Federalist, right? And the Anti-Federalists seem to be the more, at least true to the spirit of what federalism meant at the time. They seem to be the true Federalists. So if that's not confusing, I don't know what is, right? I'm slightly confused myself just talking about it, but the victor writes the history, right? So because the Federalists back in the day who were opposing the Constitutionalists actually lost, and the Constitutionalists won, and the Constitution was passed, they became known as the Anti-Federalists, right? So just a little diatribe on how things are named, right? So okay, so who were the Anti-Federalists, right? So you had three categories, and obviously there were a lot of them, right? It was a very diverse group. So you had one group who were fearful of the Virginia Plan, right? So one group of Anti-Federalists who opposed the Constitution were like some of the people who actually attended the Constitutional Convention, like Roger Sherman from Connecticut, right? So they were just afraid that the current the Virginia Plan was giving too much power to the large states, right? So that's what led to the Connecticut Compromise, was the anti-federalist position within the Constitutional Convention. And then you had those who were afraid that the Constitution gave too much power to the central government and sort of trampled on the states' rights and potentially individual liberties. And that's the category that Brutus, the essays that we read this week, would fall into, right? And then finally, there were those anti-federalists who didn't want to deviate from the Articles of Confederation at all. They wanted to keep things exactly as they were. And these were people like Patrick Henry, right? George Mason. They didn't want to change. They were happy with the way that the government was functioning under the Articles of Confederation. So you had these three different tiers of anti-federalists, right? And that's why it's hard to sort of say that there is a consistent stream of anti-federalism. With the Federalist Papers, we can see there are only three individuals, and they have a pretty consistent agenda. The anti-federalists were sort of all over the place. But there were some commonalities, right? Obviously, the main commonality was that they were fearful of a strong centralized government, right? And they were afraid that this centralized government would trample on the rights of the states and the individuals. And you still have to remember, this is coming just after they had won the revolution, right? Not long after, 15 years after that. Right, so a lot of these guys still had in their mind, being under British rule and the monarchy and the strong central government. So they were afraid of that. They were afraid that, especially if Hamilton were in power, one of the Federalist Papers we didn't read is where Hamilton talks about the importance of having a strong executive, right, a strong president. So they were also concerned that, they were going to try to create another monarch, that George Washington was going to become a monarch. All right, and then the final sort of common thread and sort of perhaps the lasting artifact of the Anti-Federalists was the inclusion of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Right, we're going to talk about that when we talk a little bit about Essay 2. Right, so the lasting impacts of the Anti-Federalists. One, we did get an inclusion of the Bill of Rights. Right, and because of the Anti-Federalist sentiment, a lot of the ratification conventions were very contentious, right? So the Massachusetts Convention was especially contentious, and they would only ratify the Constitution with the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. Then once Massachusetts made that concession, then Virginia fell into line, and things kind of went from there. So yeah, they based on what the Anti-Federalists stood up for and said, that's why we have a Bill of Rights. And I'm willing to bet that when you think about the Constitution, you don't think about the executive, the Electoral College, right? Or you don't think about the procedures for being elected as a member of the House of Representatives. When you think about the Constitution, you think about things like freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair and speedy trial, all these rights, right? So people often think of the Constitution in terms of protecting rights and not in terms of the procedures. When in fact the Constitution that the Constitutionalists had just set out, the people who were writing the Federalist Papers, was purely procedural, right? There was, with the exception of the preamble to the Constitution, there's only one mention of a right in the entire document of the Constitution, and that's the people's right to habeas corpus shall not be suspended. Right? That's the only other right that's listed in the Constitution, with the exception of the Bill of Rights, right? So it's funny that when we think of the Constitution, today and what it stands for, we're actually thinking of what the Anti-Federalists were fighting for, right? That was not contained within the original Constitution. So anyway, I think that's interesting. Another legacy of the Anti-Federalists is the creation of the Democratic-Republican Party, right? So after the Constitution was ratified, we had George Washington, obviously, who didn't have any sort of party, no political party that Washington belonged to, but his successor, John Adams, was the first and only president of the Federalist Party, right? But because when Adams became president and Hamilton was gaining a lot of power, pushing for this strong centralized government and a national bank, the old Anti-Federalists sort of united against Hamilton's plans. And formed the Democratic-Republican Party. And interestingly, James Madison, perhaps the mind behind the Federalist Papers, right? Obviously, Hamilton played a part too, but Madison is often conceded to be sort of the great thinker behind the Federalist Papers, the architect of the Constitution. Actually went over to the Anti-Federalist side, and became a founding member of the Democratic Republican Party, along with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the first Democratic Republican president, following John Adams, and then Madison followed him. Right, so this notion of anti-federalists has carried on, right? And when we think about it in conventional terms today, or perhaps not conventional, maybe going back even to the Civil War, we think about federal or central government rights versus state rights, right? And the anti-federalists were primarily concerned with the states' rights and the individual rights, and the constitutionalists wanted a more strong centralized government, right? So, okay, so essay 2, right? So Brutus is kind of making sort of a political theory argument here about the origin of government and the rights that men are entitled to, that people are entitled to, right? He said you're born with certain inalienable rights, right? Right to conscience, right to speech, these kinds of things, right? The right to a fair trial. And he says that the way government works is that at a certain point people realize that even though they have all these rights, these inalienable rights, if they want to survive and they want to prosper, they have to get together and they have to surrender some of those rights to a government, right? So that's how it works. That's how we end up in a government. We come together and we sort of say, well, if I can be a part of this group that will, protect me and have these institutions that will make my life run smoother, then I'm willing to not just go completely crazy and do whatever I want, right? I have to be constrained slightly. But what Brutus says, is of course this can be a major problem, right? When we surrender our rights to a strong government. Because in fact, what we've tried to do by surrendering our rights is to make our lives better. But what often happens if there's not a safeguard put into place is that the entity that we give our rights to abuse our rights. And this notion of the common good, if those rights are not protected, this notion of the common good actually is self-defeating, right? Because obviously if our rights are being trampled on by a strong central government, then we're not achieving a common good, right? It's only the good for the people who are in power. And, as he said, history has shown time and time again that if there's no safeguard put into place, that's precisely what will happen, is that people's rights will be trampled on. And sometimes even when the rights are written into a principle, they can still be trampled on. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, right? So even when it's written in the Constitution, those rights can still be violated, right? And he said, well, what the constitutionalists are saying is that we don't really need to include a Bill of Rights, a declaration of rights that are going to be protected of the individual citizens. We don't need that in the Constitution because it's already provided for at the state level, right? And that's when Brutus is like, well, hold up here. You're saying that in the Constitution, in Article 6, you're saying that the Constitution is going to be the supreme law of the land, right? But then on the other hand, you want to say that the Bill of Rights that protects individuals at the state level, right? Well, he says, well, look, if we're going to go all in and give, the central government all the power, then that completely violates everything. It negates all of the rights that are given to the individuals on a state level, right? Because the Constitution is to be the supreme law of the land. So, essentially, if the state, let's say a state of Florida grants the freedom of speech, right, and if the United States government finds that right, freedom of speech to be impeding what they deem to be sort of providing for the common good or providing for the common defense, right? If they find those things, then they can essentially suspend. They can suspend that Bill of Rights. So Brutus just makes the straightforward argument. He says, look, if you're going to make this a supreme law of the land, and this is sort of the last word, then it becomes necessary that you have to include a Bill of Rights in this Constitution, because the states are just not going to have the authority to uphold those liberties. So that's what Brutus is getting at with Essay 2. Essay 5, I've got a quote I want to read you guys here. This is kind of funny from SA 5. He says, this power, exercised without limitation, will introduce itself into every corner of the city and the country. It will wait upon the ladies at their toilet and will not leave them in any of their domestic concerns. It will accompany them to the ball, the play, the assembly. It will go with them when they visit and will on all occasions sit beside them in their carriages. Nor will it desert them even at church. It will enter in the house of every gentleman, watch over his cellar, wait upon his cook in the kitchen, follow the servants into the parlor, preside over the table and note down all he eats or drinks. It will attend him to his bedchamber and watch him while he sleeps. It will take cognizance of the professional man in his office or his study. It will watch the merchant in the counting house or in his store. It will follow the mechanic to his shop in his work and will haunt him in his family and in his bed. It will be a constant companion of the industrious farmer in his labor. And it will be with him in the house and in the field, observe the toil of his hands, the sweat of his brow. It will penetrate into the most obscure cottage, and finally it will light upon the head of every person in the United States. To all these different classes of people and all these circumstances in which it will attend them, the language in which it will address them will be give, 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 right? So, of course, we realize that what this power is the power to tax, right? It's the power of taxation. Probably appropriate because just a few days ago was tax day, right? So if you guys haven't gotten your taxes in yet, you need to do it. Essentially what he's saying here, right, is that there's this notion, right? This notion that the Federalists are making in the Federalist Papers, and they say that, and this is the big contention with the Articles of Confederation, right, is that if you're going to set out certain goals for a government or any organization to carry out, you have to give that organization the tools and the authority to carry out that purpose. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? So that's the whole idea with the Articles of Confederation. It was supposed to provide for the common defense, right? But it didn't have the power to collect money, right? And that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about giving somebody the tools and the authority to actually carry something out. So the central government under the Articles of Confederation did not have the power to tax, right? And that's something that is built into the Constitution, right? In Article 1, it's talking about how the Congress, the legislature, will have the ability to tax, and the problem that Brutus has with this power of taxation is that there's this clause, right? And there's this clause that says, to whatever the legislature will deem proper and necessary to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare, right, to carry out any of the things that the laws that they have deemed to be promoting the common defense and promoting the general welfare, they can make any law or essentially tax anything related to what they consider that to be. So Brutus says, hold up. Those are very broad aims, right? Promote the common good, provide for the general welfare, provide for the common defense, right? These are all extremely broad, right? And they're open to major interpretation. And that's where he gets into that whole thing about, if you interpret it that way, you're going to end up in the bathroom. The taxes are going to be in your bathroom. They're going to follow you through every aspect of your life. Right? And if you consider our lives today and the things that are taxed and the role that the government plays from top to bottom in our lives, you'll see that he's not far off. Right? There's virtually no aspect of our lives that's not influenced in some way by the government. Right? So he's saying, look, that's just too broad. Right? That's going to give the central government way too much power. Right? And what it also does is it essentially squashes the state legislature's power, right? So we have, on one hand, in the Constitution, we have this clause, Article 6, that says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And then we have this clause that says that, the central government can tax on anything they deem to be necessary and proper for carrying out, promoting the common good and providing for the common defense, right? So on one hand, we say they can tax anything they want. On the other hand, we say that their law is supreme, right? So let's say that we have one state that doesn't want to tax on a particular thing, or they want to tax on something slightly different than the way that the federal government taxes. Well, the federal government, because it's the ultimate law of the land, right, is going to be able to supersede what the states actually want to do. Or let's say that citizens don't have enough money to pay taxes to both the state and to the federal. Well, the federal government can suspend the state taxes, right, and have them just pay to the federal, right? So he's saying that again, that takes away from the state legislatures and gives too much power to the central government. And he said, he sets out and says, look, what actually needs to happen, and obviously this did not happen in the Constitution. There needs to be something very, very specific to what the taxes can actually be, like an import-export tax or something along those lines, right? Rather than giving this broad umbrella of taxation to the central government, there needs to be a more specific taxes that are spelled out. Otherwise, it's just going to, just like he said in that quote, follow us throughout our lives, right? Which is essentially what has happened. Okay, so those are the Anti-Federalists, right? This is just a very brief introduction. There's some great stuff out there written about the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate. And this week, you guys are going to be just reviewing the Bill of Rights, right? The first 10 amendments. We're going to be looking at those. So just, I can't remember if I posted something in Canvas or not on the Bill of Rights. If I did not, you can Google it, right? And just go to a reputable site, the Federal Archives or whatever, and find the Bill of Rights and take a look at those. And then next week we'll talk about the Bill of Rights a little bit. We can think about them in the context of, were they sufficient? Were the rights that sort of, Brutus fought for, were they sufficient for all the people in the United States, right? Are there some things that we missed? And are they still relevant today, right? And if we were going to subtract or add things, how would we do that? But the important thing is to actually, you hear people talking about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution all the time, but the majority of people who say that haven't read it or they're not familiar with it. So I just want to make sure that you guys have actually, read this stuff. So when it comes time to have a conversation about it in your life, about the Second Amendment or the First Amendment or whatever, you actually know what it says. So I want you to read it carefully, right? Read it carefully. And another place that I would suggest going to really get a careful reading of the Bill of Rights is the Founders Constitution, right? It's an awesome document. There's a website you can go to, and if you click on it, it has the text of the amendment, and then it has all sort of the supporting documentation that led to that creation of that particular right. So have a look at that. Next week we'll kind of do a wrap-up of all the things we've covered. And there'll be a quiz not this week, but the following week, right? So not this Friday, but the next Friday. So anyway, have a good week. If you have questions about your paper, send me an email. Have a good one.